And with that, I'd like to introduce our first speaker, Grant McKown. He is a coastal habitat research scientist from the University of New Hampshire. We had some grant funding a few years ago from the Near Science Collaborative, and we helped support a literature review about salt marsh migration, so that we could start learning together about this topic. And he did an amazing job, and we're really grateful that he was willing to recap what he found out with all of us today to set the stage for the rest of the conversation.
Okay, great. Thanks, Corey, and thank you to everyone for being here. Yeah, so David Burdick and I were asked and tasked to create a literature review on generally what do we know about marsh migration, the causes, and what's happening with the vegetation community, and what might be happening, what restoration practitioners might be doing about this, or at least trialing or experimenting. And a lot of the speakers and a lot of y'all, from all the hard work that y'all have done, are cited throughout that literature review. So before I get started, I would just like to say thank you to everyone on this call who's published, or I cold called people in 2024 or asked for random reports from those. So if you were part of that, thank you so much. And this, I will say, this report was finished back in 2024. And over the past few years, a lot of y'all have been really busy with marsh migration. There's been a flood of new research that's come on board. So I've been trying to keep up with the papers. But if you don't see a citation at the bottom of a lot of these slides, it's because I am very behind. It's amazing what everyone's been up to the past few years. But for now, I'm just going to give a quick primer on kind of what the literature kind of told us. So hopefully, maybe that will give us a lot of great background for our upcoming presentations. And first, just to put us in the mind of, or geospatially, where we are on the Marsh platform, this whole, probably most of our talks are really primarily on either the interior marsh platform that gets flooded by spring tides, or especially that upland edge, or into the upland that might get only flooded by really large storm surges or king tides. And we're looking at things like marsh elder, such as Iva frutescens, Phragmites australis, maybe some salt tarlant trees or other shrubs. So this is kind of the area of the marsh that I think most of our speakers are going to be talking about. And the thing the literature really wanted to communicate, and I think it's good to think about when it comes to what might be driving salt marsh migration into the upland, is thinking about our stressors in two kind of categories. One was thinking about these as pull stressors. These are episodic disturbances, thinking that really remove stress intolerant species in the upland and really facilitate the transport of seeds or rhizome or rack material into the upland. And these are things like storm surges or hurricanes, or sometimes people even cited wildfires might be an actual disturbance that allows for marsh migration. Additionally, I think what we are more used to as coastal scientists are press stressors. These are things like sea level rise or the metonic cycle, and these are things that gradually just increase waterlogging or soil stressors that actually facilitate the long-term survival of our halophyte species. And just one example of our press stressor is sea level rise. So this is from the Portland tidal gauge. The orange dots above is mean sea level plotted since 1920. And then the blue dots are the difference between monthly mean high water and mean low water. And it shows our 18 or 19-year metonic cycle and as it changes over time. Ideally, we also have really large pulse stressors. I'm sure all those in the Mid-Atlantic can attest to the hurricanes that y'all experience from time to time. Well, up here up in the Northeast, we experience a lot of nor'easters or sou'easters that can really drive large really large king tides or flooding. So we actually experienced a really large one here in New Hampshire in January of 24. We had back-to-back storms and places that I'd never seen underwater before were underwater, including this is the boardwalk at the Great Bay Reserve, and this is a pumping station here in Durham, New Hampshire, where the university is. Places I'd never seen underwater before. So what's going on is after these pulse and these press stressors, we are having basically interplay of three major stressors on the vegetation community. One, we just have increased flooding, and that allows for the transport of salinity and sulfides or sulfur into the shallow root zone, which is converted into sulfides. And it basically drives anaerobic conditions, saline conditions, and high sulfide conditions, which really stress out vegetation. Additionally, we have a rise in the groundwater table, or sometimes people describe it as a decrease in the groundwater table. And that just leads to even more prolonged waterlogging conditions in the upper edges of the salt marsh. Or if behind the salt marsh and upland, if we have a low-lying wetland or a low-lying area, that can actually increase the water table as well and lead to vegetation die-off. And additionally, that salinity and sulfide stress can actually lead to decline in seedling germination, stress out tree or shrub species, opening up the canopy, and can eventually lead to their death. So there are some great models that have been putting out. So I kind of stole a few of them. This is from Saccatelli et al. 2023. This is generally an idealized version in 2020, what it might look like. Here's what happens with marsh migration and death of upland species. And what the three things I kind of wanted to point out in this photo essentially was they had a rising groundwater table across the board. They had saline water push in, and so actually the saline groundwater lens was actually pushed more inland. And additionally, they had either shoreline erosion or just a general loss of elevation after the death of upland species. So these are three large contributors that are happening over time because of our press stressors. Additionally, there's been some papers that I kind of like pulled together a little bit. And they kind of did things a little bit differently, but essentially it kind of seems like there was kind of a threshold for salinity and inundation about where that marsh upland border is. And it seemed like if that area is getting flooded 3 to 5% a year, and the ground's salinity maintains 3 to 10 PSU, usually you start to have a conversion from underlying upland species to marsh species. But there are some caveats to it. But first, I'd like to say, while this is all going on, a lot of people, including Karen Gadan's lab, have shown that even if you don't have visible salt marsh migration yet, there is still a large transport of seeds and rhizomes from things like Spartina patens. And assuming there are other species like Disticula spicata and Spartina pectinata and Juncus girardi that are going into these upland areas, whether they're freshwater wetlands or they're forests or they're agricultural fields, and that their success to germinate and be stable is really dependent on both light conditions and other soil and groundwater table conditions as well. So just because we might not be able to see the marsh at a time doesn't mean that the transport of reproductive material like seeds or rhizomes might not be happening. And what the literature kind of showed is even if we hit these salinity and waterlogging thresholds, and if we have transport of rhizomes and seeds, it the ability for the marsh to migrate inland was really dependent on what the vegetation community was upland. So I always like to take a second and kind of something like we've talked about the drivers of marsh migration. Now let's talk about the barriers of marsh migration. And the first barrier could be what is the upland vegetation community? And usually we kind of have four identifying the literature. You could kind of summarize. We had Phragmites australis or common reed dominated areas. You could have an upland forest. You could have upstream tidal wetlands or freshwater wetlands, or you could have meadows and agriculture, which the meadows and agriculture is really prevalent or really relevant to the case study site today here at Great Bay. And really, after reading the literature and giving it some thought, it kind of seemed like you could break these down into two ways. First, you could think of it as Phragmites and upland forest kind of do the same things, where the marsh and the upland ecotone border was easily defined, where you could basically say this is where the salt marsh ends, this is where the upland starts in a lot of ways, and that the upland vegetation acted like a barrier to marsh due to the high shading ability. And that there was usually a serious lag between when we would expect the marsh to migrate in before the Phragmites or the upland forest would retreat or would die off. There's been a lot of papers that have shown that upland forests take a long time and that mature trees take a long time and a lot of stress to finally kill them off. So I like to think of these two communities, don't think of it as marsh migration inland, but
Is
rather
there
as
anything,
upland
Liz?
or as forest upland retreat. Additionally, if we think about it from an upland tidal wetlands or meadows and agriculture, this is kind of different. They're not the marsh and the upland a lot of times isn't really well defined. We have the combination of pulse and press stressors, and we usually have like a mixed vegetation community where sometimes you can have some salt tolerant upland species mixed with some halophyte species. And over time, it takes those press stressors of sea level rise to really make the vegetation community fully transition into a salt marsh. So these things can look really messy for a long time. Additionally, other barriers of salt marsh migration might come down to what is your legacy or what are the anthropogenic impacts to your marsh? One common thing we have in New England is basically every marsh was farmed for a long time through a series of improvements, which were a series of ditches and embankments. And we now know through a lot of site surveys that those ditches and embankments went up to the perimeter of the upland and the in the marsh itself. A lot of times they're hidden because of either phragmites or old forest. For example, here in New Hampshire on Bear Hill Marsh, we found a large perimeter ditch that went around this Atlantic white cedar and red maple swamp here, showing the white dashed line. And when we went and visited it, we found that this ditch was quite large, it was quite active, and that these series of embankments and ditches might be prolonging conditions that would, or they're ameliorating conditions that would prolong or prevent marsh migration in the first place. And of course, there's just human modern structures in the place. There's infrastructure, there's brownfields, there's homes, there's undersized tidal culverts or dams, maybe heavily used trails. And we're dealing with a few sites of that in New Hampshire. So understanding what is even going on that probably you can visually see with your eye just taking a site survey. For example, this is a paper from Aaron Berman that showed where all of the hazardous or brownfield sites and possible marsh migration zones. So overall, the broader takeaways from the literature review that we did was that there's a lot of great research happening, and a lot of it was taking place in the Mid-Atlantic, and we hope a lot more places in either the Southeast or the Northeast will do more research for their own site-specific conditions, whether that's the upland vegetation community or tidal amplitudes or other specific things that I can't think of at the moment. And it kind of showed like maybe what works in Virginia or the Chesapeake may not apply to New England. So trying to understand those site conditions are important. Additionally, it came to, I think I just said this, just understand your sites seemed to be really important to monitor, do site visits, understand your potential obstacles to migration. Understanding that this is a long-term process and that if you develop success criteria, or if you're thinking about project goals, to really incorporate a lot of uncertainty in those, be in it for the long haul. Additionally, it seemed like a lot of marsh migration projects might not succeed unless we remove barriers to those migration, whether that's marsh restoration, making sure the hydrology is correct on the platform itself, removing phragmites, doing ditch remediation, physically removing structures. This might have really large impacts. And lastly, there's still a lot we don't know, and I'm actually really excited to learn a lot from our own speakers today. But I think we are going to find out so much over the next 5 to 10 years, especially as large scale projects down the Mid Atlantic get going and start reporting results, as other people have been doing large scale geographic studies start reporting results, even just when people start doing small pilot studies or just start trying out things. Yeah, I think I'm actually really excited. It's been really encouraging to see the amount of papers being published in just the past 2 years since we did our literature review. So, yeah, with that, I'll give it back to Corey.
Thanks, Grant.